This is probably the most fun I've had making a record, and making a place where nothing stays had its own set of challenges because I don't currently play with a band or have anyone to really work out the full sound before recording the songs. And my friend Phil Norman, who did all of the music for the record and produced it, lives in Colorado while I live in Nevada. And so we had to go about a slightly different process to get this thing done. I spent about 2 years writing the songs for this record, which is not surprising for me because I tend to putz around quite a bit, especially when I get to the lyric writing for the songs. But being self-released, there was no real deadline for this project. It was a balance of telling myself to enjoy the creative process and not rush, but at the same time, move with some sort of purpose. And in the end, it still took me 2 years to finish the writing, and then we spent about a year recording it. I wrote a couple of the songs on the piano, which I have a very elementary understanding of and hadn't done before, and it gave a different feel and maybe a different shape to a couple of the tracks. And the process would involve me noodling around with a song until I felt like it was ready to send over to Phil to get his thoughts. And I would do this really piecemeal over the course of the 2 years. Phil and I listened to quite a bit of music, and so while we're conceptualizing the sound for the record, we might come across something by another artist that we thought was interesting or was in the same vein of what we were trying to do, and we'd discuss, how they might have created that sound and how we would do that ourselves. Ben Howard is a really big influence for me, and so is Damien Jurado. And I remember Phil and I having some discussions around Ben Howard's Noonday Dream album that came out around the time we were getting ready to record. And it's just such a great record full of very unique and ethereal sounds, and they just really spent some time working those sounds out, you could tell. So that was a good baseline for us and something to shoot for as we went into the studio. And another baseline for us was the sound for the band The National. Phil and I chatted quite a bit about how that was something to kind of strive for, that type of sound with really big drums and lots of electric guitar layers and synthesizer. And those references are just really important as you're trying to get your idea across to the engineer. They can just be really illustrative. And so we referred to those records quite a bit in the studio. Phil and I have done a couple of records together before this that were more singer-songwriter style. And for this record, we really wanted to do something that was a bit of a departure from that. And so the idea was to lay everything down on the acoustic guitar and then strip that out completely and rebuild each layer with electric guitar, strings, synthesizer, drums, etc., and really create a much bigger sound, like something you would do with the full band. I remember talking to Phil about the sound for the record before recording, and I made a comment along the lines of, man, I just don't know how we'd ever recreate this thing live, kind of half joking, but Phil put it into really good perspective, and he said something along the lines of, we have all of these capabilities in the studio to really create just about any type of sound we can dream up. We really shouldn't be worrying about how we accomplish that live. And that just made a lot of sense to me. And so from then on, we both kind of agreed, like, we don't need to put any boundaries around the sound or the songs when we're in the studio. Now, Phil being a full-time cellist and professional musician, he's spent a good amount of time in studios along the Front Range in Colorado. And so I really trusted his judgment in terms of finding a home for us while we recorded this project. And I couldn't have been more happy with our choice to go with the Blasting Room Studios in Fort Collins, Colorado, about an hour and a half north of Denver in the foothills. And it's unique in that it's a punk rock studio. It started as a punk rock studio, and it's grown to a really legit studio that records all types of genres these days. But I think its roots were really in punk rock. And Bill Stevenson, the drummer for the Descendants, punk rock band, had built this space, I think, just for his band to have a place to record. and it's just been around for quite a while. They've done some really great work. I know the band Rise Against records there regularly. Even bands like NoFX that I listened to growing up. There's really something to be said about the people there. I mean, it's just such a really collaborative environment, but everybody who's working on your record is just a true craftsman, and you can just feel that they're so into what they do, and this is their career. So that was a really rewarding part of the project. It's just the people that I was able to work with there. Chris Biebel, the engineer, absolute blast to work with, and just a genuinely good dude. But he was just so meticulous and so into the project. You could feel it, and threw everything he had into it, which was just a great feeling to have other folks that are just super pro at what they do, working on your stuff to make it bigger and better than what you could have dreamed it being. It's an experience that's just really hard to describe, but it's one that I'm really grateful for. So with Phil being based in Boulder, Colorado, and me being based in Las Vegas, and the fact that this was a self-funded project and we were doing a lot of the work remotely, when we're planning these 3 to 4 day recording sessions, there was always a bit of anxiety and uncertainty that I had going into a recording session, just knowing like the clock is always ticking. It's pretty expensive to have studio time. And we didn't always have a really baked idea of what we're going to do, other than, we might have a session musician coming in the next day and like, we're going to record drums tomorrow. But Phil proved to do a really great job of making sure everyone was on the same page. And so when these musicians sat down, they could plug right into the music, and they had a good feel and idea of what we're trying to accomplish. And so for me, that was a really eye-opening part of the experience, and also very humbling. I mean, these musicians were just so good at what they did. And that helped me to just kind of relax and trust in the process, because when you have a great musician laying stuff down, that'll be a layer that kind of creates a direction for the album, and then you'll have another musician come in and lay something down, and it just builds from there. Thankfully and luckily for me, Phil Norman, who produced the record, is a professional cellist, but also knows his way around a guitar and bass very well. And he also messes around with the piano a bit. So just a really great musical knowledge all around. And he was able to lay down those parts of the record himself, ultimately saving me a lot of effort and money. And one of the first session musicians we had come in was a drummer by the name of Drew Heller, who did an absolutely fantastic job. Monster player, jazz background, and he laid down some really big stuff that helped influence the sound quite a bit for the record. And we hired an amazing piano player by the name of Eric Moon to work out some pieces for us for a couple of the songs, most notably Saudade, which the piano ended up being the main element for that song, and I think turned out really, really well. We hired a great violinist by the name of TJ Wessel to do some work on the track Nothing Stays with Phil. And we were lucky enough to have Natalie Tate on the record, who's an amazing vocalist and songwriter, and she did all the harmonies for the tracks on the record. And for the art, I was able to work with my good friend and former college roommate, Jeremy Peters, who is a creative director for his own agency, Peterman Creative, based in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And Pete's a great artist, and I hadn't had a chance to work with him on any of my former projects, so I was excited to do that. Now, we came up with 2 different versions for the art, one that Pete created from scratch, which I'm really happy with. It's the mountainous background image, which turned out really great. And then the seated figure image, sort of head explosion, watercolor painting. It was something that I had seen on a Birdie magazine cover, which Birdie is a cultural arts magazine in Denver. And I think I'd picked one up a few years ago on my way through Denver on a business trip. And I'd kept it, and I always thought it'd be a great cover, but it just, for this project, the album title, and everything else, it just made so much sense. And so it'd been sitting in my office for a few years maybe, and I had the idea of maybe just at least, just for my own sanity, I wanted to reach out to the artist and see if they'd be willing to give me the rights to use that painting for the album art. And luckily for me, the artist Heather Reynolds, who's based in Denver, was really cool to work with and allowed me to do that for a very nominal fee. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm just really happy with how all of the art turned out for this project. So 6 tracks in total. A Place Where Nothing Stays was a really rewarding creative project. I couldn't be more happy with how things turned out. I feel really lucky to have worked with Chris Biebel as the engineer on the project. Really appreciative of all the session musicians who contributed to it, and most importantly, Phil Norman, my friend and producer, who really threw everything he had into it. And it's really as much his record as it is mine. It ended up being a really dear record to me, and to hear the songs grow and evolve from their original states where they are now is just a really fulfilling feeling, and makes me really excited to do it again.